Hello, today we're talking about Recursion by Blake Crouch, a very interesting book to discuss. You could categorize it as a sort of high concept sci-fi fantasy action thriller, but it's also touching and emotional and moody, and it's a lot about memory and regret and that sort of thing. And it's all meshed together in a very dense story that's overflowing with interesting ideas and concepts and directional shifts. It's not a very long book, pages-wise, but it felt to me a lot longer just because of how much stuff happens. Like, it's packed with things occurring. Just to get into it right away, when you first start the book, it presents itself as a story about this thing called false memory syndrome, or FMS. Basically, people are developing an entire set of fake memories that exist alongside their real memories. This is happening to multiple people throughout the world, and for obvious reasons, it's causing a lot of disorientation and confusion. And intentionally or not, I thought going into this that was the plot of the book. It's about false memory syndrome, and I thought it was going to be sort of the protagonists losing grip on reality, not knowing what's real and what's fake, not knowing which of their own memories to trust, how it would affect their perception of reality, in other words. Which is somewhat backed up by the opening scene in the book, a very striking opening scene where one of the main protagonists, New York City cop Barry Sutton, encountering a woman suffering from this affliction to such an extent that she decides to jump off of a skyscraper. Very quickly, though, the plot shifts with the introduction of our second protagonist, Helena Smith, a neuroscientist who is trying to invent a machine to record and track memories in order to help people with Alzheimer's, specifically her father, but ostensibly just, for the greater good in general. But instead, she unknowingly creates a literal time machine that sends people back in time through their own memories. How it works is you hook up this machine to your brain and you basically think of a memory, picture it in the most detail that you can in your brain, and this machine tracks and copies this memory as it's attached to your head. After this, you have to get into a deprivation tank. You get lethally injected, and then at the exact point at which you die, the machine reactivates the memory you just recorded. After having completed all this, you will begin your life again from that point in your memory, but you retain all the knowledge and skills and everything that you have from your life. It's a little more complicated than that, though, because when you reach the point in the new timeline where you originally went back in time, everybody else in the world regains those memories from before you went in the time machine, if that makes sense. So, for example, right now, it's December 18th. If I thought of a memory I had when I was 16 years old, I go in the tank and I start living my life again from age 16 till now. In the new timeline, when I reach this exact day, December 18th, again, then everybody who I know will instantly regain their memories from the original timeline before I went into the time travel chair. But they'll also have their memories from the second timeline of the things that occurred when I went back and relived my life a second time. And that's the cause of this whole false memory syndrome thing. It's literally time travelers reaching the point they went back in time and everybody else regaining those original memories. In my opinion, this is a super unique play on the time travel mechanic. There's, all sorts of different rules and regulations a time travel story can have. I think this is the only one I've read where everyone, not just the time traveler, is fully aware of the diverging timelines. And over time, as more and more people time travel, it creates this extreme compounding effect, which the book very thoroughly explores. I don't know if I explained that in a way that makes sense. It's a pretty complicated mechanic. The book obviously devotes a lot more time to explaining it and giving examples than I am able to give in this little summary video, but that's the gist of it anyway. When you read the book, it's pretty sturdy, it holds up, it makes logical sense, you can predict what's going to happen based on how people use the time travel chair. But yeah, like I said, there's a bunch of different ways you can do time travel. I think Recursion does do it in a very novel way. Having everything happen through memory solves the pretty common time travel issue of the past timeline affecting the future timeline. You know, Back to the Future, Marty McFly interacts with his parents too much, so it messes up the timeline, and now he's not going to be born. That doesn't happen with this because everything is happening through memory. The two timelines exist simultaneously, and then once you reach that certain point, people just have memories of both events, of both timelines. It also prevents the time traveler from going back to a time or place that they have never been before. For example, nobody could go back and change the course of the Civil War or something because nobody in the book was alive during the Civil War. They can only go to places and times that they have personally already experienced. I think one of the things I appreciate about this mechanic so much is that it's just so well thought out. Every conceivable way this type of technology could be used is explored in the book. There are a bunch of times reading this where I'd be like, oh, well, what would happen if you used the time travel chair in this way? And then a couple chapters later, that exact scenario would unfold. He really drives the concept into the ground, actually. He kind of takes it to its furthest conceivable limit, which I appreciated. He really explores every possible ramification of this particular type of time travel technology he invented. He kind of ramps it up, too. Like, at first, Barry uses it to go back 11 years to save his daughter, who was hit by a car. So the first instance of somebody going back in time is explored pretty thoroughly. You get the whole experience of Barry realizing that he's starting his life over again and kind of going through the motions and remembering all of this stuff happening and realizing he has agency to change past events. But it keeps ramping it up and ramping it up and ramping it up to the point where, like, eventually you'll have Helena going back in time 33 years, like 20 different times, and reliving her entire life over and over again and doing it in slightly different ways, living hundreds of years across multiple timelines, trying to prevent this nuclear disaster from happening once the time travel chair gets into the wrong hands. Speaking of Helena, the beginning of her character arc where she spends a couple months living on an oil rig in the middle of the ocean, I just thought that was such a cool and unique and vivid setting. I thought it was so interesting to be there in that place, just on the super high-tech, billion-dollar oil rig, completely isolated in the middle of the ocean. Probably one of the most unique settings I've read in a book in a long time. Like I mentioned before, the scope of this book is pretty impressive given how short it is. It just feels so grandiose and like so much stuff occurs. People are literally living multiple lifetimes. But the book itself is pretty concise despite that. The whole third act of this book is this super disorienting frenzy of the main protagonists living and dying and living and dying and living and dying in places all across the world, trying to prevent these different apocalypse scenarios that are happening. Also, I feel like this book pays a little bit homage to Minority Report because there's a whole through line of them doing like time travel cop missions that I thought was fun. And all throughout this, there's this nice emotional love story of these two people who are trying to maintain their love for each other across multiple lives, multiple timelines, where each time one of them doesn't remember the other one, and they have to re-meet each other, and they have to re-fall in love, and they have to relive their whole lives together dozens of different times. It's just dizzying, but also awesome, and it's amazing to me that this concept holds up despite how deep into the minutia of the time travel rules Blake Crouch gets in this thing. There were a couple instances where I felt like the story suffered a little bit under the weight of such a hefty mechanic. Specifically, there's an incident of this skyscraper appearing in New York City for everybody all at the same time. Like, people are just walking down the road, and all of a sudden there's a skyscraper that's there that wasn't there before, and they all have memories of it being there even though before it wasn't there. I won't get into it too much, but I Pretty sure that breaks the rules of the time travel set up in the book. Like, if the architect who built it reached the point in the new timeline where he originally went back, then what should happen is the building was always there for everybody, but then suddenly everybody gets memories of it not being there, an entire building just appearing. I don't think that fits in the rules, but I'm also not sure, so if anybody's read this book and has come across this part and would like to try and explain to me how that fits in the rules, go for it. But for the most part, it's pretty leak-free, I think. It's just great, entertaining sci-fi, and I do like how emotional it gets, how moody it gets. It really does dive into and explore its themes of memory and time and the nature of life on Earth, how our entire perception of time exists completely within our memories. It kind of gets into this idea that linear time is an illusion created by our human experience of living and dying. It talks about how despair and happiness can't exist without each other, and by trying to manufacture a life without despair, you are also robbing yourself of life's contrastive happiness. Even across dozens of lifetimes of trying to optimize your experience of the future or trying to retroactively adjust your experiences of the past, nothing exists outside of the moment you occupy, so you should try to love the people you share it with while you can. It sounds kind of cheesy, but I appreciate that he so elegantly was able to fuse this heartfelt, emotional conception of how the world works to this high concept sci-fi action book. Just think that's really neat. It's a really touching story, it's a really captivating story, and it occasionally might make you think a little bit too hard, but it makes you think. I'm gonna give this book 8 oil platforms out of 10.